this week, this month, we are talking snow crash. Let me introduce the folks who are on screen, but those of you who are in the audience, this is a discussion. It's not a webinar or a lecture, so feel free to chat. We may pop and see if you're comfortable turning on the camera and joining us, because we do keep it informal. Quick introduction, and then I'm going to just throw it open. So really delighted that we were able to catch the TikTok professor, Professor Casey Fiesler. You do, I didn't call it that. I think you've termed that, right? Casey has been doing these incredible bite-sized bits of really useful advice, sometimes funny, and sometimes just like very practical, like how do you get a PhD, like how to go through that process. Like really, I think, trying to use the medium in a way that might resonate with a lot of her fans and followers. I first became a fan of her work, and she's done lots of really relevant work to some of the discussions today, but I particularly got interested in her work and thinking around ethics and the ethics of research and the ethics of corporate data for research, where she and a number of other colleagues have been really at the forefront of work in that area. And she's at University of Colorado Boulder. So thanks for joining us. Amy Stepanovich is the new head of, not so new, a couple of months already, I think, head of US policy here at FPF, joining us from the Silicon Flatiron Center at the University of Colorado Boulder, where she was. Previously, she was at Access, early, I think, started her career at Epic, and super delighted to have her with us. And somebody else, speaking of starting careers, Joe Jerome, who started his career out of my alma mater, NYU Law, as a fellow. Used to call them junior fellows back then, until we realized that wasn't nice. It's like, made you sound like a musketeer or something. Junior fellow are fellows. And Joe went on from FPF to CDT to Common Sense Media, brief stint at a law firm. And today he is helping shape policy and law around the metaverse at Facebook Rally Labs. But nobody's here representing anybody other than their geeky interest in science fiction books. Oh, I got to get my hat somewhere. I don't have a hat handy. I have a Laurie Craner password tie. Have you seen it?
That's cool.
She actually has a dress. I think you can get it on Etsy, and she'll do it. I'll grab it in a minute. Okay. All right, so let's jump in. And can I maybe start with the trigger warning disclaimer? When I first read this, however many years ago, right, 1992, is it right? 1992. So when I read it, I guess sometime in the 90s, it had fallen out of my brain. I didn't remember anything about it. And when I started rereading it, which I thought I ought to do, since famously Stephenson coined the term metaverse, and I didn't realize how inspirational this book was, evidently, to many Silicon Valley types and the Jeff Bezoses and others who, all mention it or point to it. But I had forgotten that there were some really weird, bizarre, offensive scenes for those who read it through already. Sex with a very young woman, a lot of just weird, strange sexualization, genderization, and yes, it was another time, but I don't know there was another time when it was like ever acceptable to like consider having sex with a 15-year-old, even in the 1990s as like, naughty things that are not politically correct today. Like that was always outrageous. I don't know why it didn't stick with me. But so when we all started just a few minutes ago before we went online, I was like, I want to burn it now. I mean, can we even, should we just, do we say it was another time? Or do we just, what do we do with the fact that a book like this, which is like a classic, has such a offensive line of, activity? Ban it, burn it, trigger warnings.
Much more comfortable saying it was from another time if it wasn't providing the basis for so much of the vision of the future. And it's a real, like the world they paint in this book is not a good world. It's not really a world I can imagine anybody wanting to live in. There has been like people pay for things with wheelbarrows of $1 trillion bills because of hyperinflation, and they're living in a 20 by 30 storage facility, like a storage closet in a storage facility, and that's considered a really nice place to live. There's a lot of, as you said, hypergender, bad gender stuff and bad sexualization, like the 15-year-old, not protagonist, because we have a main character called protagonist, but the 15-year-old counterpart, every time she's in the book, she's like thinking sexual thoughts about whatever man is in the book with her, including Uncle Enzo, who's like a father character, becomes even sexualized in her eyes. And this is, and in this world, we have the metaverse, which is an escape from the world, which is weird because the metaverse is all, we don't get a lot of the metaverse in Snow Crash. Like I thought there was a lot more of the metaverse when I had initially read this book, and going back, there isn't a lot. But what we get is a super classist system where the elite people can get into this big pyramid club, and everybody else has like replicated avatars that all look like one another, that have Barbie style body types, and they're all walking through each other and kind of concentrated in a very small part of what should be endless. So it's interesting that this is what so many people are thinking of as the future and trying to build toward, and maybe like using this as a warning bell of what not to get.
Casey, could you include this on like a syllabus as like recommended reading without it creating an uproar given those scenes in today's college environment?
I mean, so I had the same experience of you rereading it, and this was maybe 5 years ago that I reread it for the first time since I was 17, and I would have told you like until I was 30 that this was my favorite book of all time. When I was 17 and I read it, none of these things occurred to me. And then again, I was like, wow, I was like, you know, like, did we really need the edginess of YT being 15? Like, she doesn't read like she's 15. Like, she could have been old, you know, so that's one thing. Also, like, what Amy is saying reminded me of like, so I'm, you know, also like I was trying to think, I was like, how much of this was intended as a cautionary tale? Because I was reminded of like, gosh, probably back in like October or November, there was this tweet going around, and I apologize, I can't remember who tweeted it, where it was like, sci-fi author says, in my book, I invent the torment nexus as a cautionary tale. And then tech company says, at long last, we have recreated the torment nexus from the sci-fi novel Don't Create the Torment Nexus. And so I do worry a little bit about like taking too much inspiration from science fiction, thank you, yes, from science fiction that might have been intended as a cautionary tale, but also then that if we take too much inspiration from science fiction, it's important to remember that a lot of our most famous science fiction was all written by white men. So I think that's relevant too. And I have gotten some critique for like using science fiction very heavily for this reason. And, you know, have made a really concerted effort to not do that as much, or, you know, to bring in more diversity of voices from science fiction as we think about how to imagine the future. But I would definitely have a trigger warning on this book. I don't know if I'd require students to read it. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that before.
Well, I'm trying to think what class you would actually want to make this be required reading. So I guess I'll be a little bit more bullish on the book. Jules, I wouldn't ban anything. I mean, in light of the current political climate that we're in, I actually think that's the worst approach. I guess my thinking reading the book is, so I think there's a couple of different books here. I think if we're going to have a book club talk, like what actually is the genre of this? Because it starts off, and I think, you know, Stephenson is just throwing a whole bunch of really interesting ideas out there, and to try and assuage Amy a little bit, I think that's where I hope that tech companies are taking their inspiration, just from the barrage of ideas. Like, I mean, I know I thought that the librarian character was actually a pretty interesting and compelling version of what contextual search might evolve into at some point. But like most of the metaverse stuff in the book is the interesting thinking is done a third of the way through. Then we transition to just a lot of discussion about the role of religion and civilization as a virus, which definitely would have been of interest to my teenage self. And then it wraps up with a very like almost cliched Hollywood movie action scene, which, you know, I imagine we're not even really going to talk. I mean, we could talk about how the ending just sort of it ends. But, you know, I say it as really three different types of books. One that's just full of ideas that are both interesting and potentially satire. One that's really getting very philosophical, and then just like an actual action plot that is not all that interesting and is full of not super likable or well-rounded characters.
I wonder if anybody in the audience has seen, I did Google a bit to see, he, in the various interviews that he's done over the years, you know, has he addressed this? And indeed, did he say, no, I'm just, you know, that's what got me interesting. That's how I think about sex. Or did he say, no, this was, you know, this was a warning. This is one of the dystopian things I put in there. Curious to see whether he disavows it or how he deals with it. But look, let's go to the main reason we, you know, there are a lot of great science fiction books around. We're reading this because he coined the term Metaverse and did I mean, for 1992, it did seem, even though it's not like a Ready Player One where the entire book takes place, he did think, just as he was even dealing with things like characters bumping into each other and being able to go through each other. I mean, these are issues that people working on the technology are, you know, thinking about and making decisions about today. So, you know, Joe, as somebody who's, you know, more hands-on in you know, dealing with guiding policy, how, and I assume you've all, I know Amy's got an Oculus, I assume Casey has tried or played or dealt with these devices, right? How much was he really foreshadowing and surprisingly getting some pieces of it, you know, right? I mean, it's not fantasy, right? I mean,
I think there's a lot, and this is maybe I'm going to give Amy some credit. Like, you know, maybe the book is, I don't know, it's a chicken and egg situation. What came first? The book is creating a template for people to build toward, but he actually is describing like engineering challenges and policy challenges that are part of the issue. Social VR, like spatial boundaries, ensuring that people, you know, can avoid having their virtual avatars dismembered. I mean, that's a real concern, and it's actually going to be, I think it'll get more and more interesting, because in social VR contexts, you know, we often are trying to, you know, Meta just announced that it has, you know, it's established like sort of 4 feet virtual boundaries around people to sort of curb harassment. But you could also imagine that you would want to bring your avatar into a virtual experience where you could be dismembered. Like, that's sort of getting toward some of the gameplay experiences. So I think a lot of that is really prescient. You know, obviously he's getting a lot of stuff wrong. And I take Amy, you know, the point about people having like discount level black and white avatars or generic Barbie and Ken avatars. You know, I think there's some truth to that too, when we think about how people want to monetize skins and present themselves in a host of like virtual experiences. You know, a lot of that pay to play sort of situation already exists in circumstances like Fortnite. So yeah, I think there's a lot in there where I was like, I see the vision.
Yeah, I was certainly describe some of the technical setup. Amy, what was your?
So there's a scene in the book where he is sitting in a van on his way to a concert.
Yeah.
And he plugs into, he's like, there's traffic is too bad, I'm going to plug into the metaverse. So he plugs in from the van, and while he's in the metaverse, all he does from the van is sit in his metaverse office and ask this librarian for information. I was like, this is the equivalent of me sitting in the passenger seat of my friend's car, scrolling through Wikipedia. Like, this is what I do. But why would I want to do this in a different space? And I did think a lot about like the escapism elements to this, and you're avoiding the world because the world is horrible. Like, as I started out with, like, the world in this place is bad, and you don't want to look around, you don't want to be in traffic in this van on your way to this horrible show. And in the metaverse, Hero he's a god. Like, he created the demons that I called them demons in my head because they picked up dead bodies. He has built large parts of the metaverse. He has a very prime piece of real estate. And being there makes him feel better. We do have these black and white avatars that plug in and get treated with like social pariahs because they're black and white and they're plugging in from public channels. But what we don't see, and what actually I have found to be the most inspiring thing about the Oculus and to Reality Labs, is plugging in and seeing the world. Like, the fact that I can go look at the icebergs or look at Greenland or ice, like, to see what's out there, to have experiences that are based in reality and things that I would want to do in real life one day. And I think that, like, we have a piece of technology today that can be utilized for good, utilized to change things, is being utilized in education, in hospitals, in like really amazing, transformative ways. And its source material is just pure escapism. And I don't think that's the strongest part of the metaverse. And it gives me pause to think that's the thing that we are approaching this technology as its core function.
Casey, do you have one of these? Have you played with the different VR type devices?
I've never even put on a VR headset. There's no particular reason. I'm no particular reason. I just don't have one.
And you're not like in a rush. It sounds like you're not like, I need to go get one.
No, not really. So completely coincidentally, this morning in my online communities class, I showed them the first part of the Ready Player One movie. And we did an exercise where we talked about like future regulation in that, using that type of technology. But I also asked them to think about like the good things. Because honestly, the vision of Ready Player One, I think, is more like what people are imagining the metaverse to be, as opposed to Snow Crash, which makes a lot of sense. And I'm assuming that Ernest Cline was inspired by Snow Crash and Second Life, and lots of things that have come since then. But what I found interesting was that my students were really like, they were jumping to all the bad stuff. And I prompted them to think about the bad stuff too, but like, they weren't as good at thinking about the good things that could come out of this. And I think we see similar kinds of conversations around social media and that sort of thing. But I also think that our fears around social media are getting amplified into what could happen in the metaverse. Like, just that, like, immediately a group of students were just like, how are we going to keep children off of this thing? Because it's going to be horrible. And I was like, the same way that we keep children off of, or anything else, or like I was thinking about in Ready Player One in particular, in the book, like there's, spaces that are just for children and they go to school and you learn things. So I realize what I've started talking about has nothing to do with your question, but I just think that as people are imagining like what the metaverse is going to be, whether that's inspired by Snow Crash or Ready Player One or just their ideas, like, I don't think it's all bad. Like, if it were all bad, it wouldn't be happening, right?
Well,
yeah, I guess you're happy to hear that, huh?
Well, so I haven't read as much science fiction as I think Amy has, but I always come back to the fact that, like, I'm sure there are.
Is that a compliment or a?
No, I think it is. I'm just saying, I'm just wondering, I haven't seen a genre that really focuses on like utopian future visions. I mean, the only example I really have is maybe the first 2 seasons of Star Trek: The Next Generation. And that was okay. I mean, that's not quite a utopia, particularly if you read the entire like franchise.
People explain it that way. I've heard her explain it that way.
Okay.
Or at least not a dystopia, I guess, is what. Like,
So, well, in case people didn't see that, I believe that was I can never say the name, Infomocracy, which sort of posits a Google universe full of micro democracy, which I suppose like there, there's shades of that here too, where you've got the different burb claves and people self-select into, I mean, all horrible neighborhoods, but it's still like. It's interesting that that's described as utopian because self-selecting into these small units, I think, creates filter bubbles of its own kind. But interesting.
Joe, I have a question for you. I've been wanting to ask you this since I started reading this, because I don't know if people know those glasses that Joe has on are the Ray-Ban Reality Labs glasses.
Oh.
Ray-Ban Stories.
There we go. Thank you. Do you consider yourself a gargoyle?
I mean, the functionality isn't nearly good enough. Let's be honest. I think there's a lot of interesting utility here, but the ability to be constantly and always plugged in, these are really far from it. And I think to Casey's point, like, I don't know if anyone's ever going to want to be plugged in all the time. I mean, I think there will be some people who will use this.
Are we not? I'm sorry. Are we not? I mean, I get that.
To degrees, but Jules don't. I mean, look, you were always very good at like basically unplugging over the weekend for religious reasons. But like, I think a lot of folks find ways to find elements and areas in their life to unplug. All to say, like, I would, I don't know anyone who would want to be on. Well, there are always going to be exceptions to the rule, but the majority of people are never going to want to be online all the time.
I think gargoyles are such a great example of like something that should have been a cautionary tale. Because when Google Glass, like I was getting my PhD when Google Glass came out, and like the lead technical person for Google Glass was a professor at my university, and so like, and we'd all been watching him walk around as a gargoyle for 15 years. And there's this part in Snow Crash where they're describing gargoyles, and it says something like, gargoyles are no fun to talk to because they're not listening to what you're like. You don't know if they're listening to you or if they're like running the credit cards of people around you. And I think I think there were a number of social norms things that led to the like, demise of Google Glass. But I remember having a conversation with my PhD advisor at the time about this. And I think Sherry Turkle's book Alone Together had just come out fairly recently. And we were talking about how like, it was already a problem that we're sitting there scrolling through Wikipedia instead of talking to our friend who's driving the car. But like now it was going to be so much worse because you might think that someone's talking to you, but actually they're doing something on their glasses. And I think that was like one of the like social norms things that really tweaked people about Google Glass. And I actually, I know nothing about your glasses. I didn't even know there were new versions of this. Apparently I'm just out of touch with everything. But I'm curious if norms around this have shifted or if this is still one reason why we're not seeing as much uptake of this technology, which everyone thought that by now we would all be wearing Google Glass all the time. Well,
okay. So part of it, I think, boils down to basic functionality. I remember when Jules, I have had a Google Glass, and it just wasn't super functional. So I still think we've got a long ways to go. I mean, VR headsets are still relatively heavy, can be uncomfortable. So you have to deal with the physics of form factors here, and I think those are huge problems far beyond my lawyerly brain. But I guess I'm losing the thread of what my larger point was here, but social norms are something obviously I think we think a lot about at Meta, and something I think a lot about. And so I've been wearing these glasses almost as sort of a mini social experiment to see how many people figure them out and what their concerns are. And I've been sort of surprised that they run the gamut. It's I as a privacy person, I'm sort of terrified at the prospect of people capturing me and recording me, particularly if you can do it from far away at scale. But there are plenty of people that, at least in this country, that are still like, it's in public. What do I care? I've had conversations with people who actually find some of the limitations in these to be problematic. It only does sort of 30-second video recordings, and people are like, well, what good is that? I need 5-minute video recordings. And so I've just sort of been caught off guard by what people want. And anyway, to sort of rope back around to rambling about Google Glass, I mean, I think, again, Google Glass just had limits on functionality, and the current devices still have pretty significant limits on functionality. And so before we even get to a notion where I think norms can change, you got to provide a product that people really want to interact with. And to be totally honest, like, we don't know if people want the metaverse or not. I certainly hope so, but we shall see.
It's just amazing. I think back to like AOL times, and I wonder, since, Casey, you teach online communities, every time we talk about some of these issues, I'm like, we kind of had that with Second Life, or we had that with this. And yes, it's on steroids because it's Facebook, or it's global, or it's bigger. But are the issues really going to be so new? I mean, we've had abuse. Yes, of course, it's going to be more compelling when you've got the whole visual environment. But we had people doing horribly offensive things in role play type things, in the well, and obviously we have all kinds of horrific stuff today. And yes, I feel like we don't appreciate the actual things that are really going to be the problems, right? Like, I don't think people are going to be, you want to take secret photos. There's spy things that don't have any light, or you can go buy them today for $200 and you could take your surreptitious pictures. Or by the way, you just don't have your flash on your phone. And, I the other day was sort of on the beach, and my Pixel 6 has like a super duper zoom. And I was like, oh my God, I can like see and creep on the people, 400 feet away in the water, and, zoom up, and they would just think I'm looking at my phone, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of creepy stuff that we can do today. I think that when phones became cameras, right, who could have imagined that it would completely change the whole notion of photography, from like, go pose and take a picture, to, my daughter's in Israel now on some trip, and I'm getting like, pictures of like the most mundane things because she felt like taking a picture of that rock, right? And so it changed the notion of a camera from being a pose and a picture to a stream of information. So I feel like the issues that we're going to see, when I wore the Google Glass, the one value I did get out of it, where I'm like, oh, I get it. And when I heard the Lux, the Italian, the Ray-Ban, the Luxottica, the owner of Ray-Ban, the fashionable thinker, talk about how he uses it. And he said, I ride my bike, and there's always a beautiful sunset when I'm riding in whatever beautiful place he lives, but I'm on my bike, so I don't have my phone, right? He says, and I take a picture. And when I wore mine, we had backyard chickens for a couple of months. That was evidently a thing.
I remember that.
We had chickens, right? And my kids would go out and like run around. They were small with the chickens. And, I was in the kitchen. I didn't have my camera, but I had the Google Glass, right? And it turned taking a picture into both my point of view as well as something that I could just do by saying, take a picture. Hey, take a picture. And so I feel like the idea of having information there, even now, how many times have you been in conversation? It's, oh, let me look that up. Let me get you that information, right? It's still buried in this plastic thing, which isn't really smooth. And I have to like look down. So the idea that you're going to get the information or take or transmit, look, people are walking and talking on the phone in a totally different way with their earbuds, right? And so I don't know, what do you?
Joe, you said you didn't think people are going to be plugged in all the time. And Jules, you talked about information. This is not the book. We're talking about this book. This is not the book. But the company that they imagine in this book is called Information, capital I, Information. And people are plugged in all the time, because not to virtual reality like they are in Snow Crash, but to augmented reality,
Yeah,
which is a different tool and something that you can walk around plugged into because it's part of reality. And you can still see people. And I think there's going to be a huge appetite for that, and for how you can add data and take pictures and have technology overlap with your real life, as opposed to like, I put on these which don't have a thing I can see through, even though you can see, like I've done the see through and it freaks me out.
Oh.
I shouldn't be able to see my computer screen through this. It creeps me out. But I think that the AR technologies have a much higher potential for constant use. And they're actually also what worries me for a few different reasons. A, you can change other people and how they want to present to the world. Like I can choose an example. John Verdi and I have talked about is like, everybody's all of a sudden a Disney character.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you've consented or not, but I want to walk around in Disney World all the time. So everybody I pass is a princess or Winnie the Pooh or Mickey Mouse, and it just changes everybody into something without their consent. So that's one thing. And the other is for any Black Mirror fans out there, the entire history of Me and You, where all of a sudden you can remember like exactly what happened, everything, you can pull it up. And human relationships are not built around the potential for perfect memory. And human psychology is not built around being able to relive every traumatic event in your life perfectly. And I don't think we're ready to be able to do that. I don't know if we'll ever be ready to be able to do that, but I think the technology is coming, so we need to figure it out.
Yeah, I'll echo that in the spectrum of immersive technologies. Personally, I've always thought AR is really the all-purpose use cases, which is not really present in Snow Crash at all. Like it's very much thinking about VR. All I'll say is I'll echo everything Amy just said in terms of like overlays and what that means for how we change things in society. I guess I will come back to the fact that I still think people will want options and the ability to turn that off. I mean, I guess when I say plugged in, I mean, I guess it comes at a matter of degrees. We talked a little bit about these glasses. My actual favorite feature is the over-the-ear audio. Amazon has similar glasses that let you do that. I think that's actually really interesting connected functionality that has nothing to do with overlays. Because in a universe where, we're going to have augmented stuff all over the place, I think that quickly gets overwhelming. And that's not even just in a dystopian, we're going to have all sorts of like barraging you with spam advertising. It's really just going to be too much information for folks to handle. I've looked at interesting use cases of heads-up displays in cars, which could be a really useful safety tool, but you start putting too much flashing stuff on there, you then create distractions. So finding that balance is going to be really tough, both for the companies building this, but then also I think for users. This is when I start thinking about we're going to need like different layered slices of how we interact with reality. And that leads to a lot of interesting dystopian scenarios too, where you could have a layer of reality that is, as you say, like people dressed as Disney characters, all sorts of digital vandalism all over the place, which might be less than ideal. But that's, I think, the challenge that we face.
One of the things does he give us in the book that, I mean, obviously you got the metaverse concept, the rat dog kind of weird thing. I don't know, maybe that's obviously too weirdly futuristic.
Horrifying and nuclear powered, so.
Right. Are there other kind of things that he envisions there that are, interesting or compelling in sort of this future technology world? I guess the notion that we have these little mini cities, like where, people kind of govern themselves with various, logic, which I don't know, I guess that seems to exist already in little corners of society. But are there other futuristic things from this that are compelling for us to think about?
And I think the sort of vision of like, I mean, a lot of this book's sort of about capitalism, and I think visions of labor and, you know, what's like, what has become of the government, you know, yeah, I think there's a lot of dystopic kind of structure of society things that have nothing to do with technology in this book, which is actually super interesting world building. And I'll actually tie this to the comment from Coben in the chat here, because actually I think this is really interesting. Like the issue of like a decentralized metaverse versus it being something controlled by a company. Because my students this morning were very concerned about this. Like the vision of Ready Player One being an all-encompassing, like the Oasis being something that is owned by one company was totally freaking them out, which I think is appropriate. And I think that should have been more dystopic in the book than it was. But I was bringing up like, what if, what if the internet had been invented by AOL? Like imagine how different everything would be if the internet as a thing, which I know is ludicrous, but like were, you know, owned by a single company. And you could imagine that, you know, being a possibility with the metaverse, depending on what it becomes. And if the metaverse ever became something that's kind of like what's in Ready Player One, as opposed to what's in Snow Crash, that does actually become kind of terrifying.
You remember that the early days of AOL, right, pre-existed kind of the web, and indeed you stayed in the software, and like eventually we gave you like a browser, but you know, you didn't really want to go there. That was the dirty internet. And you know, rather when you dialed up, you were in this immersive experience, and we did everything we could, and that model could have succeeded. And I guess the question is, is the metaverse going to be that model, or is it going to be, you know, where you know, people paid to build out different pieces, but we were the landlord? Is that what we're likely to see? A HoloLens, or I guess Magic Leap is now, you know, B2B. Joe, I don't want you to put on your meta hat, but like it seems like there's tools, like it does seem that there's some recognition that somebody may want to provide like the OS. Is it going to be the App Store environment? Let's assume Apple and Google maintain the current, you know, model where, yeah, you can have apps, but they have to have a certain piece, or is the notion that you know, it's architecture, and what does it look like today for those who, and I assume there are people here who've never put on an Oculus, or and it's a little confusing. There's like Horizon and there's workspaces. Like, what does it look like today in terms of central, or what other parties can do and that sort of thing?
So the folks at Meta might like this, but I really view, when I play around with my Quest, it is very much like a game console with some productivity features on the side. So if you've used a game console, you download games, you play games, those are sort of isolated. That obviously isn't the long-term vision, because that isn't letting people in Roblox come over and play in Minecraft, and go over to Fortnite and play in Horizon or Second Life. You know, the one thing I guess I wanted to say to this group, and the thing that I'm trying to struggle with, is like, what is the post-App Store vision of the future? Because I think, you know, I've been in DC a long time. When we think about regulation, laws, policies, we're very much wedded into what Apple and then Google created with app stores, where I don't know if that really works in the future, or if that's really the ideal. You know, Amy, you mentioned you're like concerned about augmented reality. What does an augmented reality app store look like? Instead, it's more like augmented experiences controlled by a whole range of different actors. So yeah, I guess my answer, Jules, is like, right now, you know, these are discrete, isolated experiences. I mean, I always find it very interesting that, like, in this book and in general, there's supposed to be one metaverse, but the reality is we've got metaverses right now, which is probably an anathema to the folks that have studied this stuff. But every company has its own different approach, and we're a long way from interoperability. But the goal is eventually to get there, particularly if you're thinking about augmented reality, where you're going to want a lot of different types of functionality. I assume if you have augmented reality glasses, you're going to want to be able to you're going to want Google Maps functionality combined with being able to pull up Yelp type of stuff on demand, being able to pull up, like, frankly, user-generated content and independent stuff on demand. I don't know how we get there. It's going to require a lot, and finding out a lot of different and interesting business models. But I raise it to this group because I do think, from the privacy professional landscape, I sometimes think we've gotten really locked into this universe that the phone and the app store is the end state of technology, and something will eventually change.
Well,
He's Amy.
yeah, no, so yeah, right. Look, as Amy notes, we've the Microsoft OS, does some basic security stuff, but we don't expect them to not allow porn the way Apple doesn't allow porn, right? And if Microsoft said, "Hey, we want to be more like Apple, no porn for you anymore," like, people's heads would explode. And we don't seem to have an expectation that the PC OS should prevent bullying or hate speech or that thing. And we somehow do when it comes to app stores, because, well, that's how that's been set up. Roblox and Minecraft, we do expect that somebody's policing stuff. Social media. Look at what happened yesterday. The European Union, right, said thou shalt not allow people to, like, repost stories from Russia Today anywhere in the world on social media, or you're violating European law. So on one hand, we're trying to push better rules and have big companies of some sort enforce them. And on the other hand, we kind of want it all open, and we don't want central control. Are these just unavoidable gaps? Are we going to have big central players because nobody else is going to have a big enough, rent a cop police force?
I'm going to say a lot, and I'm not going to answer the question because it took me to the end of this book to remember that really the theme of this book is mind control, like how to control a large population. That is the goal. That is what everything in this book is driving toward. Is our multimedia guy, who is probably more than a bit unhinged as a character, thinking of people. I think he calls people biomass that are feeding his multimedia machine. And he made some comments that reminded me of what we've heard about companies talking about leaks from employees, where he was like, I give my employees information, they learn things, and then they can go out and do anything with them. They're like they become part of their brain, but that's my information. Why are they doing things with my information that they get because they're employees of mine? And that level of needing to control everybody under you, there's a level of paternalism there as well. If you don't read it to like the hyper nefarious levels that this book takes everything to 11 or 12. So if you scroll it back a little bit, it's just needing to do what you think is best, like having everybody do what you think is best. And when you control everything, you get to just control what's best. And we all have, we come from different parts of the world. Technology is global. We have different cultures, we have different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different genders. Maybe we don't always know what is best for the world. And one thing that struck me with the librarian, I wrote this down, there's just no misinformation that he has, that he only says factual things, but he's a piece of code.
Yeah.
He says over and over again, I can't make judgment calls. But we assume everything he says is factual, which means we're in a world with no misinformation at all. There's just a lot in here that I think we need to realize is what Casey started at, a cautionary tale of what we don't want to get to. And I think part of that is control, and part of that is information access, and that you can't he's imagining a world where all the information is truthful, and that's not the world we live in. I don't think we can control people to that extent.
Casey, I'm having dinner next week with the CEO of a leading different VR company. If I was going to recommend some reading, say, if you want to make sure you're thoughtful or you anticipate or so on and so forth, where would you point them? Is it, are there various novels or like readings from different courses that you teach, or would you say go back to read the early days of the well? Like, what would you, you know, if the goal was here's where you should educate yourself as somebody who's sort of written and studied about the online community side of the world, what's the most resonant kind of examples to point to or read or?
Oh my gosh. So back in the fall, I did this TikTok that was like science fiction to prepare you for the metaverse apocalypse. But you know, it was like Snow Crash and After On, and you have some other novels like that. I mean, I think to some extent, you know, science fiction is good at actually, okay. So I've been giving this talk lately about like ethical speculation and this idea of ethical debt, which is like technical debt, but let's think about the social things before we build stuff. So I don't know, have them read my op-ed about ethical debt, but also I've been talking about how like there's this quote from Isaac Asimov about how science fiction writers are really good at foreseeing the inevitable catastrophes, but catastrophes are inevitable, but solutions are not. And so the problem with, you know, reading a bunch of science fiction is like, it might help you think about some things that might go wrong, but it's not going to like tell you what, tell you how to not get there. So I've been trying to figure out like, how do we help technologists think more like science fiction writers? I mean, you know, if you want to go back, like I was thinking earlier when you were talking about like lessons from the past, I was reminded of Julian DeBell's book, My Tiny Life, which is about Lambda Moo. And in particular, you know, the part of it that was published as a rape in cyberspace, which is like just this really horrific, like, and I sometimes have students in my class read this with trigger warnings, and like they can't believe that this was in text. Like this was just all, it was just all text. And I often use this as an example of like all this stuff, like this is not new, but like whatever the new technology is, I don't care if it's, you know, like a car or the metaverse or, you know, the internet, Second Life, like whatever it is, awful people are going to use it to be awful. And so I think the biggest trap that technology designers fall into is that they're not considering that. Like they're doing, you know, user personas of like, here's how the soccer mom's gonna use our VR headset, and here's how, you know, the bookish college student's gonna use our headset, and not like, here's how the, you know, stalker X is going to use it, or here's how like the person who just wants to harass women is going to use it, right? So I think like that's one of the most important things is like you have to think about bad actors when you're designing things in the same way that you like, how can we make this better for the soccer mom? Okay, how can we make this worse for the white supremacist, right? Like that would be my big lesson. I'm not sure what to read, but that's, you know, if I could get people to do more of something, it would be that, which requires some speculation. And you can't just be like, well, I can't see the future. I don't know what bad actors might, like, you know, we know.
Some folks are commenting about the whole notion of identity, and in a couple of conversations I've had, it is interesting to think how we deal with identity is going to be a core, you know, element of what do I take my social media profile and relationships with me? Can I go from item to item? In the couple minutes we have left, people have pointed out in sort of the comments, obviously the anonymity question, which is a whole conversation in itself. But what are interesting thoughts around identity, right? I mean, some of the social media, have established real name with the notion that there's value to that. And, you do see how, say, Facebook today, for my college age kid, it's not where he does his socializing, but that's where you can connect with people. And then you go ahead and you exchange other information for WhatsApp or whatever it is. But the way you find your, such and such class of 19, whatever, isn't on all the tools you use. It still is the directory of the universe. And immediately everybody forms a group, and then they end up moving on, to other things that are, more for communication to them. So is the metaverse going to be, is there always going to be a real world, real name place? And is that important for certain things? I mean, if I'm going to job interview or today we have both, and for better or worse, we have both, and they serve different purposes. Anyway, thoughts on specifically?
I'll just say, I mean, I think we will always have both. I mean, the idea of having one universal identity, people talk about it. I don't think it's realistic. I think when it leads to a scenario that can be really dystopian or authoritarian, where you can't have different personas in different environments. And I think the real lesson that a lot of the folks in social media have learned over the past 2 decades is that people behave very differently in very different scenarios. And I think the metaverse, augmented reality, and virtual reality is only going to continue to expand that and create different types of scenarios. I'm actually a little bit embarrassed. My Oculus avatar, people keep saying it looks more like you than any other avatar I've seen, because I'm just sort of this boring bearded bald guy. But I almost feel a little bit bad about that. Like, why am I choosing to represent myself so similar to my real life persona, when really the benefit of all of this technology is to allow people to express themselves in different ways and in many different forums. I don't think you're going to, it doesn't need to be necessarily connected to your real world identity. We obviously want to avoid scenarios where people can impersonate other people in the virtual world, but I think that still requires different mental models. I'm drawing a blank. One of my friends in tech policy I was discussing with them the notion of, wouldn't we want to protect sort of people from impersonating celebrities in Fortnite? And the reality is, we should be allowing is that really what the concern should be? As long as we have sort of, in certain scenarios, verified accounts for certain people, I don't know if it really matters that there's 1,000 different people who look like Jules Polonetsky roaming around in social VR, when there's still a way for the real Jules Polonetsky to represent himself, even if he's actually representing himself as a privacy dragon.
I'm sort of rambling. A cryptocurrency way for me to make a couple of pennies from each of those people who's used.
Well,
then you have the other side. The article that Casey referenced, the rape in cyberspace, was people being forced to watch themselves do things. So if I, as Jules Polonetsky, walk up to Jules Polonetsky and behave in a way that he finds shameful, that is an intrusion upon autonomy that's really disturbing in a lot of ways. Like that, for people who haven't experienced VR, the thing that I have internalized the most about VR is how much you are there. The first time I did it was a test where they threw me up on like a 50-story building, and I'm in real life, like going like grasping for a gate that isn't there to hold on to, because I felt like I was up on that building. And you really do feel like you are there, and the people who are around you are there, and you are embodied. And I don't think you can really take that for granted, is how much that feels like reality, even if you know it's fake.
We are at the top of the hour, so I want to thank you all, and thanks to the folks in the comments and chat who really contributed as well. I know I've been following it and really appreciate the input. Thanks to all of you for chatting with me. What should we read next? I don't know. I've got a couple in my stack. Amy, Infomocracy is on my list after you recommended it. I haven't gotten to it yet. Sounds like it might be a good one, but then there are a couple academic books that we probably need to get through as well to keep up with the important scholarship that many of our colleagues are on. Thanks, everybody. Join us next time, and do ping us with suggestions for books on your shelf that you would like to have us all chat about.
Thanks for including me.
Thank
Good to see you
you.
all. Nice to see you,
Thank
Casey.
you.
Bye, all.